Because man's task is to make the earth after the model of heaven. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Man's project is to heavenize the earth. Man is made to transform the world from glory to glory, to take hold of it and break it down and remake it after the image of heaven.
Welcome back to the Reformed Reset. My name is Grant, and joined with me is my beautiful wife, Erica, the weaker vessel.
Hello, everyone.
If you would, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit the like button, leave a comment, and hit the bell if you want notifications every time we release new episodes. We would greatly appreciate it. It all helps us a ton. And if you're in podcast land listening, make sure you subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. Especially in, if you have an iPhone, in Apple Podcasts or in like Google Podcasts, those reviews really help a lot. And so we'd really appreciate it if you went on there and just said, they're awesome. Really, you don't have to write a big long thing, Just give us a review.
Thumbs up.
There you go. You can go to takeholdstudios.com to check out more of what we do. There's a merch store that we have. There's a link in the description below. You can find us on social media. And if you want to financially support us monthly, then you can go to patreon.com/takeholdstudios and get access to, submit questions. That'll be on a monthly Q&A. And
yeah,
I think that's it.
Is that enough of the business?
That's enough of the business. If you know,
you know.
Exactly. Okay, let's get right into it. We are still marching right along this covenant theology trail. And last episode, we talked about the Mosaic covenant, as it is frequently called or commonly called. The covenant at Mount Sinai that God made, where he created essentially the nation of Israel.
And then today we're going to talk about
the Davidic covenant.
The Davidic covenant. Okay.
So, Israel's a nation, right?
Is this one going to be a shorter one, you think, or no?
I'm gonna.
It's funny because the things that you think you're not going to say as much about, you do, and then vice versa, I feel like.
That's so true, huh? So I think this will be a shorter episode, but let's see. We'll see what happens. Now, I made mention in the last episode how you see God sort of expanding his covenant people, right? He started with just Noah and his family at first, and then it was Abraham. But Abraham was meant to be a big family, and we see it grow to 12 sons that become the tribes of Israel. But at that time, it's very tribal. There isn't like national unity. Well, that is achieved after they are brought...
I always hit my microphone. Sorry, guys.
It's at least like one time an episode, right?
Always.
It just needs to happen.
Like a child.
God brings the people out of Egypt, out of slavery, and then they are unified as a nation, and they're unified around the covenant document, right? Which was the covenant law that they are given. And so it doesn't matter what tribe you're in, you are saved by God and you obey the covenant law now. Then what happens is Israel gets a king. They go about it the wrong way. They want to be like the other nations rather than God in his own timing giving them a king, because we know that Israel was supposed to get a king at some point, because Deuteronomy 17 has laws about what kings were to do and not do. Right? So having a king is not unthinkable for the nation of Israel.
Which is another weird thing that we were taught growing up. Whatever reason.
Right. Like it was only sinful for Israel to want a king.
Yeah.
Now, what was sinful was how they went about getting their king.
Right.
They said, we want a king like the other nations. So they wanted to be like the world, rather than say, we want a king, Lord. Is it time? Or who do you have? Right? And then...
Wasn't that part of the blessings given to the heads of the tribes, too? Right?
Yeah.
Like one tribe was supposed to be the kingly tribe.
Right. And that ties in perfectly with...
Judah, right? Judah was the kingly tribe?
And that's the tribe that David comes from. So that's the thing, too, is Saul becomes the first king, and God sort of kind of gives them what they want. So for them to realize this wasn't a good idea.
But it's more in a Romans 1 style, I feel like.
It is. Yeah, turn them over to your desires. And Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin. He's not from Judah. So from the get-go, right, they want a king that is not what God has even told them prior, right?
Right.
They should have looked in the tribe of Judah for their king. But remember, the reason why they picked Saul was because he was taller, he was handsome and strong, and that's a kingly man. Mm-hmm. And you're like, it's not even the right tribe.
Well, it's like they looked to earthly requirements rather than the ones that God had given them. Like, be born in this tribe, which is a pretty simple one. Instead, they're like, oh, he looks nice and strong.
Right, yeah. It turns out a little shepherd boy, David, is more brave in battle than he is, and more trusting in the Lord than he is.
And that's because, God's way works, man's doesn't.
Yeah. So there's so much. You guys, go get Peter Lightheart's book, A House for My Name. Mm-hmm. Okay? It's his Old Testament survey, but the things that he talks about regarding David is phenomenal. Also, his commentary, Peter Lightheart's commentary on 1st and 2nd Samuel, which is called A Son for Me, I believe it's called. Mm-hmm. It's so good. And he shows in so many different ways how David is he's a prefigure of Christ. He's the type of Christ in so many ways, not just kingship, right? We know Jesus is king and he's the king on David's throne because in this covenant that God made with David, he promised that him and his seed would sit on his throne. They would be God's representative rule, right, on earth forever. He said forever. There were still covenant obligations. God still said, you and your sons need to walk with me. Mm-hmm. And when they don't, God disciplines them. Mm-hmm. And you see that when they're kicked off the throne for a time. Notice in Isaiah it says that it's the stump of Jesse, right? It's not an uprooted Jesse.
Right.
It was just cut down, and then a little branch comes again later, right? The
shoot.
Exactly.
The shoot of Jesse.
Yep. But the nation is talked about like a stump. So it was cut down, but not uprooted. So God kept his promise to David to have one of his sons on the throne forever. Yeah. And then, of course, Jesus is on that throne, and he lives forever because he's divine. Anyway, I love the covenant with David because of all of the types of Christ that are in there. Even David being the second king, right? And Jesus is the second Adam. Yeah. He's the second king of earth, right? Adam was supposed to be given this rule and take dominion of the earth, but he failed. It's like Saul got the throne, failed, and then it's the second one that walks with God and has a heart for God, you know? There's so many things like that you can see when you look at the life of David and you just think about, okay, how did Christ fulfill this? Mm-hmm. Or what does this tell me about who Christ is? Right. It's really, really cool.
Taking it a slightly different direction, but not quite.
Sounds good.
I'm going to go a little James Jordan with our priest, king, prophet paradigm, or whatever you would call it. Is that right? Paradigm?
Sure.
Anyway, we'll go with that.
I like it.
So you see, as we're going through all these different covenants, we start off with the priesthood. Mm-hmm. And then we are now moving into kingship when we talk about the Davidic covenant. Mm-hmm. And this is important to see because it tells us of the natural progression of Christians. Yeah. Or how it ought to go for Christians.
True.
We talked about priests and the Mosaic Law and all this kind of stuff. And then, so priests do what they're told. Mm-hmm. Priests are given rules. Priests are told offer sacrifices exactly like this. Mm-hmm. And if you do anything wrong, you're probably going to die. There's a real risk of death. Right. So this is how Christians and children actually start out. They're priests. They're priests in your home. You teach them how to obey exactly as they are told. Right. And then the next step is moving in a maturing, kingly way, where now you've mastered how to obey, you've mastered how to follow rules, and you've learned wisdom, and so now you have to rule by it.
Yep. And that's what the king's That's what the kings were required to do. And Solomon was praised by God for asking for wisdom.
Yep.
Not riches and fame and, that I have my kingdom be the big. He said, I need wisdom.
Yep.
And it's because every situation that a king faces is not exactly detailed out like all the tasks of a priest are.
Right.
And that's another reminder of the garden and how Adam and Eve would have eventually, they would have grown in maturity if they were good priests. If they were good priests, if Adam was a good priest, then he would have matured into kingship and been granted access. This is hypothetical, right?
Right.
But granted access to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. When Solomon asks for wisdom, he says, I need to know good and evil. I need to know the difference. So that way I can rule faithfully.
Righteously, yeah.
So that's the knowledge of good and evil is a kingly attribute. And then the next covenant we talk about, which is, James Jordan calls it the restoration covenant, and then the Bible specifically calls it the new covenant. That, where do we hear about this covenant? Through the prophets, right? And then even after David and Solomon, there's a time where we don't really have an office of prophet, really. But then in comes Elijah, right? Later on, when the kings start going haywire, and the kings need to be reminded what their job is and what their task is. And so the prophets are risen up by the Lord to preach. To preach to the kings and to the people and to try to keep them right. And so you're right. You see this progression, how God even works covenantally through the priest, king, prophet paradigm of maturity and the way that God works in the world.
This is why covenant theology is just so utterly practical. So many families, women that I've talked to just think this is like a thing that they don't need to know about. Theology is for their husbands or it's for the pastors. The average, housewife doesn't need to know these things. But it's so important because as you're raising children, this is so practical. This is so practical in how you raise your children. We can get so caught up in parenting philosophies or whatever, but it's like really we just need the Bible. We just need the Bible, right? Our kids start off as priests, and it's our job to help them into a mature kingly role as they get older. That's our job. So covenant theology matters even in parenting.
James Jordan is the one that we've really learned a lot from, and it's this paradigm that we've really learned it from him. And Lightheart applies it in a lot of his works too. But it helps you even read your Bible, and for me, it just gave me more interest in the Bible, and it was more exciting to read the Bible. And then you can, read the life of Solomon, and then you go, okay, which stage did he do well in or do bad in or whatever?
Right.
And it's like he did pretty good priest stage at the very beginning, and then he did a real great job with the king stage. But then during the king stage, kind of went crazy. And that's how you get the book of Ecclesiastes, right? There's hundreds of wives and hundreds of concubines and parties and all this stuff. But then prophet stage, Solomon comes back because he writes Ecclesiastes and says, I did all these things and it was vanity. And let me tell you where the real meaning of life is at. Right? Doing your works unto the Lord and all that kind of stuff. David.
Christian duty.
Yeah. David, kind of the same thing. Really good up front. Really great priest. He was anointed king, but he had to flee so Saul wouldn't stick him to a wall. And he was patiently waiting for the Lord to exalt him. And then he did, became a king, was a phenomenal king for a long time, but then the later half of his kingship, right, falls into sin and stuff. And then his later years, when he's kind of that elderly prophet, the one teaching the other kings and priests, is when he does really well too. The consequences of his sin don't leave his house. They don't leave his life. Right. Which is a good reminder for all of us. Which again, this covenant theology, this paradigm can all tie into our lives practically.
Yep.
Right?
It's
matters.
Really practical.
Every stage matters. So, as far as the importance of studying the Davidic covenant, another thing is just seeing that David is the second Adam. He's a type of the second Adam. And then that rule, that sovereign rule, that is so important for us to remember. Not only, of course, does God rule us in creation, but Jesus has been given kingship and rule.
Yep. Right
now. 1 Corinthians 15 explicitly says it. He is ruling and reigning right now. Revelation has a couple mentions as well. I just read another one too. And
last episode you sounded pretty theonomic. This episode you're starting to sound post-mo.
So they go hand in hand, I believe. It's hard. Can you find any post-mill that are not theonomic or theonomic that are not post-mill?
I'm sure they exist.
Leave a comment if you're one of those unicorns. But most of the post-mill...
God will work it out in your heart.
Amen. Yeah. But that's important too, because the dominion lost in the garden was in typological way reclaimed with David, but then with Christ, fulfilled.
Right.
Christ has regained the rule of the earth and dominion and sits on his throne ruling all the nations.
Ruling and reigning right now.
Yep.
Currently expanding his kingdom.
Exactly. And it's not just in heaven, though his authority is derived from heaven, which is what he meant when he talked to Pilate and he said, my kingdom is not of this world.
Right.
Meaning my kingdom, the authority of my rule doesn't come from any of y'all. Doesn't come from you, doesn't come from Caesar.
Right.
Or anything like that. It comes from above.
Right.
Which means no one can take his rule from him.
Right. So,
anyway, not too much shorter.
No.
But anyway, I could study the life of David over and over and over again with this kind of, he's a type of the Messiah.
As a pastor, I think you probably will.
Yeah, there you go. Anyway, I love it. It's a lot of fun. And
you should too. Actually, we all should.
Right. David being a type of Christ is much more than just the fight with Goliath.
Yeah.
Right? That
just
is
a smidge more.
That's a big one, but his entire life is a type of Christ, and it's fascinating to read it and think about that. It's a good study. So, get to it. The actual covenant with David is, I think, 2 Samuel 7. I don't have it pulled up. I'm pretty sure it's second. So if you wanted to go actually read, like, when did God do this? 2 Samuel 7. David wanted to build a temple for God. I need to build you a house. I have this palace, and you have nothing. And then God says, no, your hands are bloody. I'm going to build you a house. And he was talking about his family. And he was talking about that kingship, that kingly line that he's going to build for David. It's pretty cool. Anyway, all right. Next episode will be Restoration Covenant / New Covenant. And this will be fun. The good stuff.
The good stuff. It's all good stuff.
It's all good stuff. But then now we're getting to consummation and fulfillment here. You know, it's really cool. And our understanding of the new covenant has changed throughout the year. So this will be a fun thing to talk about.
Let's do it.
Okay. Thank you guys for listening. And until next time, take hold and reorder creation by first reforming your home. This has been the Reformed Reset.
But on the basis of grace and on the finished work of Jesus Christ, the project is back and forth, and the destiny of a new transformed world is assured.
I just put the sourdough in the oven too, so I've got like 40 minutes.